As a responsible person with growing concerns for your privacy and personal liberty, you want to know where we're headed and what you can do about it. We ask the experts what you need to do to take prudent and responsible action to safeguard your family's wealth and well-being, and what basic first steps will help you to be aware and prepared. ReluctantPreppers.com.
Welcome back, Reluctant Preppers. Tonight we have a very special first-time guest, Galen Lehman, CEO of Lehman's. Much more than just Lehman's Hardware. Lehman's has been around. They've been pioneers. They were here over 60 years ago and have been supplying off-grid, electric-free supplies, equipment, and coaching to people who want to live a self-sustaining, self-contained lifestyle. They've been around since the beginning. They operate out of Kidron, Ohio, where their home base is. They have a huge retail store there. They are a large catalog operation, internet presence. They have all kinds of coaching, training, and seminars in their shop and on the phone. Galen, welcome to Reluctant Preppers.
I'm happy to be here.
And we understand the Lehman's was founded by your father, and he still works there in the store and helping meet the needs of your customers. We talked to your sister, Glenda, in our last interview, who's the VP of Marketing there and Communications for Lehman's, and she gave us an overview of the mission and principles and the services that you provide, but she promised that we could have experts back on to talk about some real key topics: heat, water, light, and food. And we have you back here to talk to us today about how to keep your family warm when the furnace is out. It's a vital topic of survival and of preservation of not only life and health and comfort for our family, but also preservation of the home, preventing bursting of the pipes and all kinds of damage, that sort of thing. So if you could start us off by explaining to us what are the options that are available for keeping your house warm if your furnace has failed, or if the systems that you rely on to keep your furnace running are no longer available.
One thing to keep in mind with Lehman's is that we started out serving the Amish, and so we tend to look at what our situation is and then make a decision based on that, and all of that process for us is colored by our experience with the Amish. And when you look at how they live, their goal is to stay with family, to stay with friends in the area where they started. And the thing you have to realize is when things are bad and there's no heat, the first thing people will do is leave. And if you want to stay with your home in cold weather, and if you want to stay with people you know, that means staying fixed. And the only way to stay fixed in cold weather is to have a way to heat your house. So then the next question is, well, if I want to stay, what am I preparing for? And with the infrastructure we have, there is a possibility that everything will go off the tracks and we'll be without any supply for a period of months or a period of years or a period of weeks. I personally have a lot of faith in the systems that are established that in the event of a disaster, things will come back online eventually. The true fact is, if they don't come back on for years, we're all in big trouble because we don't have enough natural resources like firewood or available fuel to sustain us in cold weather, winter after winter after winter. There's just not enough. In 1 or 2 winters, all the wood in North America will be stripped because everybody will be burning it. So preparing for that kind of a disaster is very, very difficult without a huge stockpile of fuel. So let's back up a bit and look at what might realistically happen. Here in Northeast Ohio, we've had power failures that have lasted for weeks or days commonly. I personally have been through almost a 2-week power failure. I think it was during the New England ice storm, and the disaster was big enough that it just took them a long time to get everybody turned back on. I'm near the end of the power line, and the result was I was one of the last people to get power. I could look across the field and see neighbors with lights on, but I didn't have any. So I've had a little bit of experience. Have you had a similar experience?
The closest example I can think of is when we had straight line winds of over 50 miles an hour that knocked down a bunch of trees and knocked out the electric power for over 3 days, and we were at risk of having a whole bunch of food spoiled in 2 freezers of ours. So my wife had to drive all over the area to bait shops, finding blocks of dry ice to keep our freezers protected. And we bought an inverter that we were able to connect to the car and keep power enough to keep our refrigerator running and prevent spoilage.
So in a similar way, we had neighbors that had frozen pipes, and you talk about what sort of a disaster that is. I mean, we're talking thousands of dollars to make the necessary repairs, to say nothing of, future possibility of mold and the things that go with water damage inside the house. So our goal was to avoid that. Our goal was to stay where we were, to stay together as a family, and to stay with neighbors we knew. And that meant we had to find a way to heat our house. So in a very short-term power failure, the answer for heat and for light is actually surprising. It's a kerosene lamp. A kerosene lamp, especially one with a mantle in it, like an Aladdin lamp, for example, will generate about 2,000 BTUs an hour, which isn't a lot, but it's enough to keep 1 or 2 rooms warm, and it's lots of light too. So, for an investment of just less than $200 and maybe another $50 or $80 for fuel, depending how much fuel you want to stockpile, you can have a short-term source of heat that will keep you comfortable and also reduce, possibly not eliminate, but reduce the chances of your pipes freezing. Are you familiar with the Aladdin lamps?
I'm more familiar with the old Coleman camping lamps where you put in white gas and pump them and then light them, and they have an ash mantle in there that glows extremely brightly. So
the key is the mantle. If you want white light to read by, you need something with a mantle, and we can talk at another time about lighting with kerosene. But so the key is to get that mantle. But the thing about an Aladdin lamp is that the wick is designed to generate heat instead of light. It ignites the mantle. It makes the mantle glow or incandesce by making it extremely hot. And that side benefit of that heat is that heat then lands in your home. So when you need heat in a power failure, you can generate, a relatively small amount, but enough that in mild weather for several days or in cold weather for a day or two, that may be all you need. They actually run on kerosene, and the advantage of them is that they're simpler to run than the kind of mantle lamp that you pump. You light them just like a wick lamp, take the top of the burner off, apply a match, put the top of the burner back on, and adjust, and you're set to go. They're very simple. The kerosene fuel is much safer to handle than propane or white gas, and it can easily be stockpiled if you keep it in a sealed container in a dark area, or you use a container that's got colored sides or opaque sides. Then the fuel can last for years.
From a safety standpoint, what kind of ventilation do you need to provide in order for your family to remain safe while you're using that kind of equipment?
That's really a good point. It's important with anything that's unvented, which would be the case with a kerosene lamp, or if you use a kerosene heater, that you have adequate ventilation. And so if it's an older home, usually there's adequate ventilation, just air infiltration that's coming around the windows and that kind of thing. In a newer home, though, you may have to crack a door or crack a window, which of course is counterproductive when you're trying to stay warm. That's a good question. It's very important to provide adequate oxygen.
Now, a lot of people who want to be prepared are concerned about the shelf life or the longevity of some of the supplies. And you mentioned storage of the fuel. How long and in what way is the most long-lived way to store the kerosene? How can you store that for many, many years?
I think if you're in northern climates, most homes have a basement, and I think that's the ideal place to store the fuel. Stays cool and fairly consistent temperature, and is also away from light, which, of course, the light's not an issue if you have an opaque container like a metal container or a dark plastic container. In that case, I've never seen anything on the life of fuel. I personally have stored it for multiple years, like 5-6 years, and had no problem after that time. So I don't have data to support it, but I think you're probably looking at 10 years. If it's stored at consistent temperature and protected from light.
And that these, in addition to providing light, can provide significant amounts of heat. That's how it came up. And so, I mean, how many of such kerosene lanterns would a person need to provide sort of survival heat source for a typical family home?
So it depends on the climate, of course, and depends on how well insulated you are. But 2,000 BTUs will keep a room with no other heat. Let me process this a minute. It's also going to depend on how many walls exposed to the outside. I would think for a typical home, you'd need to have 4 or 5 of them. It's going to depend a lot on the weather. You know, you're talking in northern climates, you're talking about temperatures between freezing and, 32 degrees above zero and 32 degrees below zero. That's a pretty wide range.
So beyond kind of this survival minimalist amount of heat that you could get out of kerosene lanterns, if people really want to seriously provide comfort heating for an entire home, and they want that to be supplied by a technique or a technology that is not going to be as susceptible to interruption, what else should they consider for main heating?
Yeah. After that, I think the best option is a wood stove. So there are non-electric gas heaters and there are non-electric kerosene heaters. If you have natural gas, then let's just talk about those two options, and then we'll go to wood, since that's the most expensive choice. If you have access to natural gas, since the utility lines are buried, it usually means that you will have natural gas through a disaster that's not, impossible in scope. I mean, like a nuclear blast or something like that, then we're in trouble with natural gas and a lot of other things. But in most cases, since the natural gas lines are buried, unless the refinery is damaged, there's going to be a supply of natural gas. And natural gas heaters don't require electricity in many cases. The key to look for there is one that has a standing pilot light. Some are available with battery ignition, and you're relying on the battery, and that's not ideal. So gas heaters with a standing pilot light use technology that is often called thermopile technology. The heat of the pilot light generates a very small amount of electricity, just enough to activate the thermostat. So now you've got thermostat control, which is an incredible luxury in a extended power failure, and you've got heat, often enough heat to keep your house comfortable, the whole house comfortable. The outer bedrooms, since there's no ductwork, the outer bedrooms or outer rooms may be a little cooler, but it's livable, and there's usually enough heat there to keep the house from freezing.
Now, when you were talking about ventilation earlier in the case of kerosene lamps, now we've upped the scale to a much larger amount of heat. Aren't we talking about a lot more ventilation needed for safety on this scale?
That's an excellent question. And if you're interested in serious emergency preparation, I would not buy an unvented gas heater because the amount of oxygen required for something that big, now we're talking, instead of 2,000 BTUs, we're talking about, ideally you'd want to go 30, 40, or 50,000 BTUs. I think to go less than that would almost. If you're going to go for the expense of a gas heater, I think to go less than 20,000 BTUs would be a mistake. I think you want to go to the next step where you can really seriously heat your whole house. And when you're consuming that much, the amount of oxygen required for that much flame, you're going to run into problems with inadequate air supply. So you definitely want to go vented, and there are two styles of vented heaters. One is called B-vent, which still requires inside air, and the other one is called direct vent. With direct vent, it's like a double pipe, and the outer part of the pipe goes to the outside, The outer part of the pipe draws in fresh air, and then it's burned inside the unit, and then it exits through the inner part of the pipe. The two pieces of ductwork are kept completely separate and all concealed inside one piece of pipe. So the advantage there is that now the unit is the area where the flame occurs is hermetically sealed from the house. It's using only outside air, and the heat lands inside the house where you want it, and then the dangerous fumes are vented to the outside. And you'll want to ask when you're shopping. You'll want to ask for thermopile or non-electric ignition or standing pilot light. If it has any one of those three things, it's all the same. It means it doesn't require electricity, doesn't require a battery, and it can be run on a thermostat with no outside source of electric.
So that sounds like a pretty good option for people who want to have something that doesn't take electricity, but what's the downside?
Well, the downside is that you're relying on utilities. And for people that don't have natural gas, now they're talking about propane. And of course, propane has to be delivered. It has to be stockpiled on your site. The cost of the tank is a factor. So with propane, your horizon of how long you can heat your house is shorter. So the downside with natural, to put it succinctly, the downside with natural is that you're relying on someone else to provide you with the fuel, and you're trusting that whatever disaster comes, it won't be big enough to take down the refinery, which, in most cases is a pretty good bet. If you're using propane, now you've got to buy 500-gallon propane tank because any smaller won't last more than a few days. So a 500-gallon propane tank, and that means probably about a $1,200 investment for the tank, and the fuel it holds would be another $1,500 or so. Or you could go bigger, go a 1,000-gallon tank, and now everything's proportionally larger, maybe $2,000 for a tank, the fuel to go inside, possibly $3,000. And, that may sustain you for a month or 2 months, depending how full the tank was when the disaster hit. But after that, you're on your own.
Is there such a thing as a dual fuel gas heater that can switch over from natural gas to propane so that you're freed from that dependence on the utility supplying you with natural gas, and you can just, if you run out of natural gas, just flip over to propane?
You can often convert them, but I wouldn't describe it as a preferential change. It's like you need to understand the technology, or like if you read the owner's manual, it will tell you it can only be changed by a certified gas technician. I'm not certified, and I can do it, but it's not, you have to know what you're doing. So I wouldn't describe it as a preferential change. And usually when people have access to natural gas, they use it. It's lower cost than propane, and it's much more convenient because you don't have to have a tank. So I think the decision would be made based on what the person has available to them. If you have natural gas available to you, I would use it. And forget about propane, because the cost of buying the propane probably outweighs whatever incremental benefit there is of having your own supply. One thing I realized I should probably address is the cost of all these options, and this would be a good place to do it because I started talking about the cost of the propane. So the kerosene light we were talking about was less than $200 and maybe $50 to stockpile fuel. The gas heater, you probably can expect a vented, let's stick with vented since I said that's the best way to go. A vented gas heater, you can probably expect to spend with the vent. You might get something for $800 or $1,000, but I would expect closer to $2,000. And then if you have to use propane, of course, you have the cost of the tank and the fuel that you have to stockpile. With wood, I think now you've graduated up to somewhere between $1,500 and $3,000, including the vent. The vent is a challenge because it has to be higher than the house. With gas, it doesn't have to be higher than the house. With gas direct vent, it just goes through the wall and stops. But with wood, you've got to go higher than the house. So if you have a 2 or 3 story house, now the cost of the vent goes up. But in most cases, you can get by for less than 3,000, including the vent. And then for the technology, to answer your question, you're right. Wood stove technology has advanced dramatically. And it's amazing even to me to see what they've been able to do. A big advancement, the biggest one probably, is in the efficiency. A number of years ago, EPA started regulating wood stoves. EPA required essentially that they make no smoke, and a lot of wood stove manufacturers went out of business trying to solve that question. But the ones that stayed, the ones that figured it out, what they figured out is the way to not make any smoke pollution is to burn the smoke before it leaves the stove. And the result is the efficiency goes way up. 20 years ago, we were proud to sell something that had 50% efficiency, and now they're kind of dancing with 80% efficiency, which, if you're cutting your own wood, that's a big advantage. That's a lot less wood to cut. And the other thing is how they burn as a result of burning the smoke. You can actually see the smoke burning. It's like theater. I mean, it's just so cool to watch. A lot of times in the latter stages of the burn, when there's not normally much flame, toward the end of a log burning, it essentially becomes charcoal, right? So the charcoal bed is laying there glowing. It's still producing combustible gases, and those gases are burning maybe an inch or two above the burning coals, like they're detached from the burning wood. And those flames coming out of the smoke, I would say, look like northern lights. I mean, it's just beautiful to watch.
Yeah, it's just almost theatrical in its beauty. My wife and I, when we visited your retail store in Kidron, Ohio, we were looking at the expansive display of wood stoves of all different types, and there was one that was operating. It must be one that, like the one you're describing, and I've never seen anything like that before. Just the amount of flame filling the entire chamber, and in slow motion, it was just beautiful to see. They would be a showpiece in anyone's living room.
Yep. So what happened as a result of the EPA rules is that stoves were more expensive to make. And when they were more expensive to make, people said, I don't want a black box like Grandpa had. I want something pretty. So the manufacturers began to upgrade the appearance of the stoves. So, for example, one stove we carry that's particularly handsome in my opinion, of course it's always a matter of opinion, right? But it's particularly good looking in my opinion. It's made from stone. So the stone is buffed and takes on a marble-like appearance. The type of stone they use is called soapstone. Soapstone absorbs heat. When the heat first hits it, it absorbs a great deal of heat. And then later, when that heat can't be kept in the stone permanently, later when the fire is dying down, the heat is released. So the result is a normal wood fire produces most of the heat in the first 3 to 4 hours. At that point, the stone is absorbing a lot of that excess heat. It's more heat than you want in many cases. The last 3 or 4 hours of the fire, when the fire is dying down, when the house is starting to cool, that stone is releasing the heat. So the result is that the heat output with a soapstone stove is much more even. And these stoves, they're called hearthstone. Hearthstone stoves provide more even heat for a longer period of time. I've had them going already when 12 hours after I lit it, the fire was practically out. It had a few small embers, but maybe enough to rekindle it, but it wasn't making any heat. But the surface of the stove was still over 300 degrees.
Well, that's really a long-lived heat source.
So that's 12 hours of usable heat.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't like the thought of having to get up and stoke the fire several times during the night, or they're afraid it'll go out while they're away for their normal day at work, away from the home. So anything that can be long-lasting like that is going to really set people at ease as far as ease of ownership.
Yeah, I think in most cases, I mean, even on the short end, you're probably looking at a 6 or 7 hour burn. I think in most cases, whether or not you get a good night's sleep is not the factor. The stove will still be going in the morning. The real question is the way people work these days. If you're in your normal part of life, there's not a disaster on. You want to get up in the morning and go to work. You have an hour commute. You're often gone from the house 10 or 12 hours. And having a stove that can still be going when you come home, there may not be a huge amount of heat there anymore, but all you got to do is throw wood in it, and it goes again. You don't have to strike a match. That's a huge advantage. So talking about that long burn time, the other thing about that long burn time is that you either have to buy your fuel or you have to cut it yourself. And when you have that high efficiency with that long burn time, you're talking about a much smaller amount of wood. Here in Ohio, a typical stockpile is like 6 to 10 truckloads of wood, pickup truckloads of wood. And that sort of stockpile may sound like a lot, but it stacks tightly. It can be stacked outside, where it's not protected from the weather, so it's easy to store. You don't have to worry about, for a period of a year or two, you don't have to worry about any kind of natural disaster taking it. After a year or two, then you got to worry about bugs and rot. But you can store it for a year or two with no special provision, and that's enough wood to sustain you all winter long without restocking.
So what are some rules of thumb to guide people on how much wood they really need to store up to make sure that they've got enough to keep their family heated through the winter?
It's complicated because the amount of heat that you need in the home is dependent on the size of the home and the weather where you are. I can answer based on Northeast Ohio, which is, it helps people often to know what growing zone you're in. We're like between 4 and 5 for our USDA gardening zone, and at that place, the amount of wood I mentioned, 6 to 10 pickup loads, is usually enough for a whole winter. If you're in Minnesota, where the growing zone is a lower number, then you'd want to go extra wood. The fact is, if wood burning is practical in your area, there's a supply of firewood, it's cold enough to justify the investment. If those things are true in your area, the fact is your neighbors probably know how much wood to burn. So it's not hard to find out. The dealer where you buy the stove may be able to tell you.
For people who want to make sure that they have enough wood on hand and they're storing it correctly, is the concern that you mentioned about it only lasting a few years outside if it was exposed to the weather? I mean, if you cover your wood or keep it in a shed, doesn't it just get better the longer you store it? I mean, isn't drying it out and seasoning it just continue to age and get better as it goes?
Yeah. When I talked about rot, I was thinking of outdoor storage with no protection whatsoever. The one drawback on that type of storage is that sometimes your wood pile will freeze together, and you can always knock it apart, but it makes bringing the wood in a lot harder. So covered wood is always preferred, and the better it's covered and the more it's up off the ground, the less problems you have with rot and bugs. And so you have to ask yourself how long you're going to be storing it for. If you plan to just keep a year ahead of fuel, then you don't need any big provisions. But if you want to store it multiple years ahead, yeah, it should be stored inside. And you were asking, well, you thought it just got better. So here's the problem that I've run into. It's not very common, but it has happened often. When the wood is stored for a long time, of course, it gets drier and drier and drier. And the old-timers used to say, well, dry wood is always better. The thing is, the newer stoves that are more efficient, they're more particular about the type of fuel that they have in them. And when you load them with super dry wood, they're a little harder to control because they tend to want to kind of race ahead. So when you, in other words, when you load them with super dry wood, you may end up with too much heat. And then when you try to slow them down, they tend to kind of cross over to a place where they're hard to regulate. So what they do, I kind of know the technology behind it, but it's probably too hard to explain for radio. What they do is they will race ahead, and then they'll slow down, and then they'll race ahead, and then they'll slow down. And when they race ahead, the smoke combusts at one time, and unburned smoke is pushed into the room because of the expanding pressure inside the stove. So when that happens, of course, your room fills up with smoke. You don't want that, right?
Oh, I think we've all experienced that.
Yeah. So the thing to do in that case is to try to mix green wood in with dry wood to kind of temper it a bit. And usually that's a solution. But if you load a stove, get a rip-roaring fire, you load it with all dry wood, there is risk that that'll happen. And there's no huge dangerous health concern unless there's sleeping occupants in the room. But it does make, it's unpleasant for sure.
For people who live in an existing home and want to retrofit and add a wood stove where there isn't one, if they're in an older home, they may have a masonry existing brick chimney. But if they live in a new suburban home, there may be no proper chimney. If you look over, a lot of these high efficiency furnaces got plastic pipes for, combustion air input, plastic pipe for exhaust out. So what does somebody need to do to provide a proper chimney for adding a wood stove to an existing modern home?
So there's metal chimney that just screws together in sections for far less cost than brick or stone. And in a newer home without a chimney, or in an older home with any chimney, with any home without a chimney, that metal chimney is your best option because of the cost. The fact is, it also works better than a masonry chimney. Smoke naturally travels in a spiral. When it exits, it wants to flow like a corkscrew up the chimney, and these metal flues are round, and so they encourage that. The other thing is that the best metal flues are insulated. So when you go look for metal chimney, it's often referred to in the industry as Class A chimney, which is the classification put on it by the government to indicate that it's safe for wood stove. So if you look for Class A metal chimney, the best thing you want to do is look for insulated chimney, not air insulated, but chimney that actually has insulation in it. That chimney stays warmer on the inside and cooler on the outside, and that means it's safer, and also being warm on the inside, it provides stronger suction to lift the gases out of the house. Those chimneys are stainless steel, often with very long warranties, like even 5-10 years. Long warranties. And somebody with basic carpentry skills can install. Of course, you can also have a professional install them. And the installation will be over. If a professional's doing it, who knows what he's doing, that installation is most likely over in a day. Minimal mess, much lower cost than brick. We sell Duravent, and other brands are available. Metal Bestis is another brand that is a good one. So there's multiple brands out there, and the cost is much more affordable than masonry.
Could you talk to us about wood storage inside the house? If people are wanting to make sure that they can get adequate supplies of wood conveniently and into the home so that they can refuel their furnace when they need to, night or day. They don't want to get bugs and critters coming into the home, and they don't want to have to be tromping around outside of the house or whatever. But what's the most convenient way to be able to bring wood into the house and have it ready for use where you need it?
Yeah. Stockpiling it inside the house often will attract bugs. When I burn wood, I usually try and store it outside the house and just bring it in on a daily basis. It's less convenient that way, but less chance of bugs. We have at the store and on our website, we have like big canvas bags that can load enough wood for 1 or 2 days of burning, and still carry them with one hand. For me, that's the easiest way to do it. The bag contains the mess, and you're not bringing in a lot of wood at one time. One consideration that people often don't think of when they look at wood heating is the amount of space it requires out of the home. So if it's a smaller home, the amount of space can be a significant challenge. A wood stove usually requires at least 16 to 18 inches clearance all the way around it. Some stoves require much more, but the well-designed ones, can get by with less. Rear clearance, usually 10 to 12 inches. Make sure you check the owner's manual. But the point I'm making is that you need space around the unit. Your furniture has to be kept away. It's probably going to take up a 4x4 or a 4 foot by 4 foot or 4 foot by 5 foot area out of the corner of your living room. And some people can't afford that space, but that's a factor to consider as well.
Any other tips to consider about adding a wood stove to your home?
One last thing on burning wood. We've talked up till now about heating stoves. Heating stoves are very good at heating, not so good at cooking. And in long-term power failure or other natural disaster, you're going to need a way to cook. So we also carry wood cook stoves, and those don't heat as well, but they cook well. So there's always a compromise to be made. Is my primary concern heating, or is my primary concern cooking? There's cook stoves that heat well, but not as well as a wood heating stove. And as I said, there's heating stoves that can heat but don't cook that well. The advantage of a cook stove is that you've got an oven, so you can bake. You've got a big cooking surface on top. The modern cook stoves, like the ones we carry, they're airtight. They hold a fire overnight, just like a heating stove does. And they do a pretty decent job of heating. But that's something to keep in mind. If you're preparing for a long-term disaster, you need a way to cook as well as to heat.
Now, we've only scratched the surface today on how to keep your family warm when the furnace is out, but when we had your sister Glenda on the show, she was quick to point out that Lehman's is much more than just an equipment provider. You guys also do seminars and teaching and have lots of training resources. So if people really want to dig in the next layer deep and learn more about adding a wood stove to their home, where should they go?
So online, we've got Lehmans.com, and if you go there, there's blog articles there that go into depth on a lot of these principles. If you're in our area, you're welcome to stop by. We offer classes pretty regularly, about every other weekend or so, on various aspects of living a simpler life, a more sustainable life. In addition, you're welcome to call. We've got experts in the store and in our call center who had to take special training, who have had to certify in order to hold their jobs. They've had to certify in specific areas of living a simpler, more sustainable life. And, we're happy to help. That's what we're here for. We want to help.
Well, Galen Lehman, CEO of Lehman's Hardware and Lehmans.com, we're just so glad to have you and your family in our corner here on Reluctant Preppers, guiding us on the equipment that it takes to be more self-sustained and self-reliant and to do off-grid and electric-free living. We just thank you for joining us for this first time on Reluctant Preppers, and we'd like to have you back again soon to talk about how to keep your family out of the dark when the lights won't go on.
Happy to be here and happy to help anytime.